Hello and welcome to a Wednesday webinar from the International Centre for Sustainable Carbon. My name is Benedicte and I'm part of the communications team here. Our monthly webinars are based on our technical reports, which are available from our website, sustainable-carbon.org. Residents of our member countries and employees of sponsoring organizations can download our reports at no charge after a one-off registration on the website. And please type any questions you may have in the questions box as we go along, and we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. The subject for today's webinar is energy security and the future demand for sustainable coal, presented by Dr. Andrew Minchener. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Benedicte. Good afternoon. I think it's just gone 12. And on behalf of the Centre, I'm very pleased to be giving this presentation today. And for the information, I'm the General Manager of the Centre as well. So I'm going to talk about energy security and the future demand for sustainable coal. And I'm hoping the thing will move forward. Thank you. And this is the scope of my presentation. I'm just going to say a few words about the Centre for those of you who may not be so familiar with our activities. Then below that, I've listed out the sort of sections of my energy security study presentation, which will finish with a couple of takeaways and a few final thoughts, which may aid the discussion that will follow. We were formerly the IEA Clean Coal Centre, but as our programme evolved, we found that we were looking at a greater range of carbon-based feedstocks, solid carbon-based feedstocks, and that we were also getting much more involved in different feedstocks, as I said, but also our activities broadened enormously. And so a big discussion with our executive committee, and that led to changing the name to the International Centre for Sustainable Carbon. We remain, of course, a technology collaboration programme under the auspices of the IEA, and I would recommend that you go and look at our website when you have time, because that provides not just a lot of details about the change, but also about the whole scope of what I think is a very excellent programme that you would find very interesting. Right, with that in mind, let's move on to the security study. This basically sets out in generic form the importance of energy security, but it also draws on the issues arising from Russia's aggressive attacks on the Ukraine. And it also provides an example of some of the consequences arising. This slide is a representation of the energy trilemma. Now, this is a visualization of the need for balance between three things: energy security, energy for quality of life, and energy and environment. And the important point about this is that there's no one topic that dominates the others. All of these are important in different ways. And so when you're setting up an energy system, you've got to be aware of the need to balance these three things, rather than say maxing out on energy environment or energy and security, for example. And it's a challenging thing to do. But I'm putting that up here because I'm going to come back to this a few times as I go through the rest of the presentation. I think it's also critical to recognize that global energy consumption and supply are not homogeneous worldwide. And this slide provides information on the relative amounts and access to energy sources in different parts of the world. And I think you can see that the darker brown colors actually represent essentially the OECD countries, which on this basis and indeed other bases are far better placed than the developing nations in terms of the access to energy and also how they can use it most efficiently and cleanly. We're talking quite a lot about Russia today, and this is some information from the US EIA, which presents selected energy exports from Russia. Now, Russia is a major fossil energy exporter, and its current focus is on OECD, Europe, and Asia. But of that, you can see that some 74% of the gas that it exports goes, and 49% of the oil go to the EU, whereas more of the coal actually goes to Asia. So there's a quite clear causal link between OECD, Europe, and Russia for those two major, for crude oil and natural gas. Coal is primarily an Asian thing in relative terms. I think also, as has been highlighted in recent months, the Russian aggression towards Ukraine has made worse what was already a difficult trading situation. As countries raised their energy demands while emerging from the COVID pandemic, that created shortages, and that's led to significant rises in energy costs. And I think it's also important to note that the responses that arose because of Russia's aggression towards Ukraine has also led to further perturbations in the energy system, which has pushed the prices of energy and a lot of other products that much higher. Sorry, this slide. This slide is just again showing the situation. We can jump that one. So I'm also moving on to the fact that there's been a lot of talk about many countries have applied sanctions against Russia. The situation isn't quite as straightforward as that, as this slide shows. This shows the countries have definitely sanctioned Russia under their own terms. And you can see essentially that is the OECD countries. The developing nations have not. In particular, China and India are more than maintaining existing import links for fossil energy with Russia. We think about regional security issues and the impact on future coal use due to Russia's war with Ukraine. I'm going to look at that on three regions: Europe, the EU part of Europe, then the eastern parts of Europe, and then I'm going to look at Asia and very briefly on the USA and Canada. So this is the situation within Europe. We have the European Union. It's wealthy, it's OECD focused, it has very strong environmental drivers led by the European Commission. In the green, we have the Eastern European countries that do not necessarily wish to join the EU. Some do, some don't. And they have slightly different focus. They have more focus on ensuring adequate and secure energy, perhaps with a lower level of drive for the environmental issues, at least at present. We then have some of the former Soviet republics still, some of which are interested in EU membership, and then of course we have Russia. Russia is a massive country, as I'm sure you're all aware, with the bulk of the population living on the western side of the country, and the energy sources that we're starting to talk about much more over to the east. When you look at it like that, Russia is really not very far away. So let's think about the EU's energy security concerns. I think it has become very clear very quickly, the EU has a weak strategic energy position since it has been so dependent on imports of Russian fossil fuels. In fact, of its imports, more than 39% of its gas, 27% of its oil, and 46% of its coal were imported from Russia, at least prior to the breakout of war between Russia and the Ukraine. Put that in number form, this costs $850 million US per day for the EU to meet its bills for gas and oil supply, plus a relatively meager $20 million US per day for coal supplies. So these are major money. And it's created a key standoff. You have the EU wishing to criticize and not support, and to support the Ukraine, of course, rather than Russia. It buys massive quantities of fuel, as I've just indicated, and that the costs and the monies from that sustains Russia's war effort at the moment. And it also leaves the EU dependent on finding alternative supplies if it is to be secure. And if it does that as well, there's the benefit to the Europe of hurting Russia financially. So the energy security and EU response, to put this in context, Russia's coal and oil will be sanctioned. It hasn't been sanctioned yet. Russian coal will be sanctioned by the EU to take effect from the end of August of this year, while the oil that's delivered by sea in tankers but not by pipeline will be sanctioned by the end of 2022. The reason for this sort of not being sanctioned immediately is in part due to the contracts that were in place between Russia and the EU, and also because some of the member countries objected to the way that the sanctions were being applied, made out that they were a special case, which I'm sure was the case, and they've required a longer time to wean themselves off the Russian fuels. It must be said that Russian gas imports are not greatly affected yet by EU actions, but it is starting to happen, as I'll indicate. For example, Russia has started to cut or reduce gas supplies to Bulgaria, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Italy, Austria, and Slovakia. And on that basis, the EU is desperately now starting to look to secure additional alternative gas supplies for winter use. And the other point, of course, is that coal may well fill this gap if they run the coal-powered power stations again rather than switching them off. That can free up a limited amount of gas to be used for home heating, which can be important in various parts of the EU region. If we move on to Eastern Europe, you see dotted around the left-hand end of the block that is Russia, there's a number of countries, all of which are essentially the Balkans region. They're not part of the EU, and in many cases aren't aspiring to be so at present, whereas some countries in that region take the opposite view. In almost all cases, they see great value in maintaining coal for enhancing security, plus energy diversity. So within Eastern Europe, it doesn't seem to be creating major problems for Eastern Europe because primarily it's working off coal that isn't Russian coal. We're starting to see some of the countries redefine their modes of operation because they wish to join the EU, and that will require them to close down their coal plants in due course. But the majority are looking to maximize performance of the existing technologies because, for the reasons listed here, they can use indigenous energy sources. That reduces energy import dependency, allows for easy availability of indigenous sources, again, that enhances national energy security, but also allows them diverse sources of energy. It gets them away from this dependency on one supplier or one fuel. So that's Eastern Europe. Let's move on to Asia. Asia has an enormous impact on energy supply and use, not just in its own region, but worldwide. And in particular, you have there India and China, which are massive countries, massive energy users. If we look at this next slide as to why that is, this slide I think is very insightful. Over 50% of the world's population live in the highlighted region, which is Asia. So of the world's population, the 50% live in that highlighted region. But they have access to only something like 38 or 40% of indigenous fossil fuels, which means there's a need to draw in other energy sources, both by trading, primarily by trading. The other point, of course, I've already made the point, and I'll make it again, is that China and India have a major impact on the global energy scene and also dominate what happens in the Asian region. So India is the third largest energy consumer in the country in the world. Probably within 10 years, it will be the second behind China. Its energy use has doubled since 2000. 80% of its demand is met by coal, oil and solid biomass. But at the same time, there's a very rapid increase in variable renewable energy, primarily solar power. And it does have a target to reach carbon net zero by 2070. If we look at China, well, that dominates the global energy mix in all sorts of ways. It's, for example, the largest oil importer in the world, and it's seeking gas import opportunities, which I'll come on to in a minute. It's also starting to buy discounted coal, both for power and coking applications from Russia. And from the oil point of view, in 2021, it bought 1.6 million barrels per day of Russian crude. It also imported 323 million tons of coal, which is in fact only 8% of its total coal consumption. So it's a massive carbon emitter. It has a target to reach carbon net zero by 2060, but several people have told me that will not be at any cost. So there's got to be a strong business case behind any changes that they make. In terms of India and China's cooperation with Russia, India is already taking advantage of discounted Russian energy. It's purchased 6 million barrels of oil since March. It's starting to buy both steam and coking coal in large quantities, but not so much. It's not so much driven at the moment to buy up the gas. China basically has a bilateral cooperation agreement with Russia, which is continuing. It's interested in purchasing more Russian energy, especially gas, and it's also doubled its imports of coking coal since March 2021. Last point is simply because though China has a lot of coal and uses massive amounts of its own coal, its coking coal isn't particularly good quality, whereas that from Russia is much, much better. So they're buying that in, again, at a discounted price at present. I think it's fair to say that both countries are quietly resisting OECD pressure to stop buying Russian energy. But I think it must be something that needs to be considered. There's, I think, a very strong prospect that Russia will turn away from its EU markets and focus on the major opportunities within Asia itself, again, namely India and China, but also other countries as well. And in that regard, the big oil field that supplies, that sends the oil, a big gas field rather, that sends the gas west towards the EU. Further east, there's another offtake from it which sends gas, already sends gas east, and that goes into the northern part of China. There's also scope and a lot for extending that considerably, though they would need quite a large amount of infrastructure investment before that became reality. The other point to remember is that within Asia, though most of it is developing nations, there are two OECD countries, so South Korea and Japan. They currently trade with Russia. That said, Japan is phasing out Russian coal imports that account for about 11% of its energy imports. It's looking at possible nuclear and renewable options to fill that energy gap. But it's especially seeking coal from other producers within the region. South Korea has supported international sanctions, but not any individual sanctions of its own. It's very dependent on coal, oil and gas imports. Both countries are, in fact. But it's also very hesitant about over action against Russia. And I guess that's working at the moment because there's no evidence of its energy supplies being disrupted. The other point I want to stress here is that Japan is also looking at other options. For example, Mitsui announced last month it was increasing its stake in an Australian forestry company up from 23% to 49% of the assets, of the shareholding. Other companies in Japan, and you have to remember that land in Japan is very scarce, are also investing in timber assets, with the Sumitomo Corporation, for example, planning to double the area of forests it manages in New Zealand to about 100,000 hectares. So biomass firing and co-firing appear to be a promising option, especially for Japan and possibly in principle also for South Korea, which again will make them less dependent on fossil fuels in every sense. Brief word on North America. There is considerable coal, oil and gas resources there, as we know. A lot of coal we've known about, a lot of oil we've known about, and then shale gas transformed the situation, particularly in the USA, a decade or so back. It creates a surplus of energy that it produces, and that is now exported. The USA and Canada are enforcing sanctions against Russia. And the other point to stress is that the oil and gas from Canada comes in on the western side of the country and then goes across to the east, which is not an ideal approach for getting those energy products to the European Union. There's also moves to introduce liquid natural gas, which again can be readily exported from the USA, though currently it is near maximum capacity, so there's not too much scope to increase output to support the EU. So with that in mind, what does this mean for coal use worldwide? Well, I'm going to consider the regions I've just talked about again. So what does this mean for the EU? And I think we have to look at this, as I've done here, in the short to medium term, what's being done, almost on a demand, to ensure that they can shore up the energy structure in the very near term. And then there's the longer term situation with the expectation this war will be settled in an appropriate way. And then there'll be a longer term consideration of where coal fits in the overall energy mix. So on the short to medium term, there's certainly very much a significant rising demand and rising price for coal, even because it's much lower cost than gas, notwithstanding the price increases that have been seen, because gas has been going up as well. As well as power generation, as I think we've talked about in many of our webinars, coal is very useful in industrial applications such as cement and coking. Of course, it will result in unabated carbon emissions within the EU, which will obviously give them concerns given the program they have in place to reduce their carbon emissions. The impact of this is really in the short to medium term, is really depending on the duration of this war and how quickly the EC can implement its upturn in variable renewable energy and energy efficiency, which it announced a few months back through its Renewable Power EU program, which is an addendum to the Green Deal program. In the longer term, I would suggest that the future for coal within the European Union is bleak, since nothing has changed, and I don't believe, in the EC's thinking, irrespective of the security concerns. It will address security concerns in other ways, not by bringing in more coal, but by increasing variable renewable energy and energy efficiency still further. And on that basis, the scope, in principle, there's scope for addition of CCUS to existing coal plants, but that doesn't seem to be an option in the mix at present, because decisions already appear to have been taken to close coal power plants by 2030 across the EU. So on that basis, you wouldn't spend capital on bringing CCUS into the existing power plant sector. Spend a little bit of time on Eastern Europe. I've listed there the Balkan countries, Kosovo, Bosnia, Serbia, North Macedonia, Montenegro, but I've also added Kazakhstan in there, though that's strictly a Central Asian country. And I've also, for comparison, included Poland, the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, and Germany from the EU. You can see there's considerable amounts of lignite used, whereas there are also, in many cases, also with bituminous coal. And as I indicated earlier, most of these non-EU Eastern European countries continue to value coal power, and that dominates many of their energy systems. I think it seems likely they're going to include modernisation of their coal-fired facilities in their forward planning, and they certainly look to be showing interest in CCUS as a means to limit carbon emissions. All that said, in global terms, this is probably the requirements for additional coal will not be massive. I would also just like to note that I've worked on these sort of issues with the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, And many of these countries have certainly expressed considerable interest in coal power and CCUS, but they're also interested in options such as coal to hydrogen, coal to ammonia, where they're looking not necessarily to use that in their own countries, but as an export opportunity in the greater European region. So, not, I said, not overly significant in global terms. However, let's move to Asia, which certainly is. For a long time, coal's going to be the energy driver for this massive region. There's a lot of renewables going in as well, but coal is going to be driving things, particularly in India and China, which, as I've indicated, dominate the continent. CCUS needs to be established here, particularly in China, so that abated coal is very much a prospect. There's been a lot of integrated projects already completed, underdeveloped, but if one country, I believe, could take forward the demonstration results and establish CCUS on coal-fired plants of its own or other countries nearby to achieve a target of carbon neutrality, it is China, who has a massive track record of taking technologies forward in this way. Moving on to the key takeaways. I put up the energy trilemma again in a rather simplistic form this time, but I think it holds good looking at the way, the things I've talked about in the presentation. And no nation can afford to lack resilience in its energy system. That resilience cannot be ignored. And when security of supply can be threatened, the resilience has got to be there to counter it. I think international cooperation must be important. Whether it is at the moment, when people, seeing the autumn not too far away and the winter not too far away, and the need for energy supplies to, ensure houses keep warm and so on. But I think, under normal circumstances, international trade and international cooperation is an important issue. Final point there among my takeaways: things don't always turn out as expected. I don't think what happened in Russia was quite what Mr. Putin was expecting. And we'll see how that goes. Final thoughts. As I said, complacency is a concern, and as this energy security problem is demonstrating. Relying on one supplier to a very great degree, especially one that can control energy sources to ensure political decisions can be made in their favour, is creating a security problem for yourself. And it does raise questions about how various regions worldwide can establish mutually beneficial trading arrangements, as I said. I think it's also important I believe, to stress that there's no single solution to the global requirement for clean, affordable and secure energy supplies. No one-size-fits-all solutions that are available, and what will work in one region may not be most appropriate in others. And so each country really has to decide their own way forward. That said, I think the European Union, with its Green Deal and its REPowerEU addendum, appears to be moving almost towards a self-contained energy system with very strict environmental standards, which is very credible. But I think it also means that if that moves forward, as I believe it's moving forward, then you're going to see a situation where if you're going to trade with the EU, you're going to have to meet their standards on particular products. But again, I was talking to some of the people in Kazakhstan actually, and they're very interested in coal to hydrogen, and they say, well, the EU is very big, very important. But there's a lot of other countries out there that will be interested in the products. So if the EU is going this way, I think the fundamental question is who's going to be moving with them. That brings me then to the end of my slides. I hope you have found it of interest. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any, I'm going to look at the questions now, but if at the end of this session you have other questions, please contact me or Benedicte through our website, and my email address is, for example, on this slide, and I'll do my best to answer them after, in the near future. So let's try and find the questions. Oh, quite a few. Good. You said Russian gas imports are not greatly affected by EU. From Fueli, you're quite right, I meant exports. My apologies that that slipped through the checker. Have you considered the idea of the West rationing coal, oil and gas instead of the current de facto rationing by price? We're starting to look at that, Hugh. We haven't done much on it yet at the moment, and we're talking to the EU, for example, just to get their thoughts on that. It's an interesting idea, and I think it's certainly one that we're going to be looking at in the near future. Gabrielle Romascu has asked, speaking about security of electricity supply, coal could be considered in the energy mix in any case. That is absolutely correct. The percentage depends or varies from country to country. That's quite right, and certainly if you can bring in CCUS as well, then you've got abated emissions from the coal-fired plant, which is going to make it more attractive still. With steel plants, will steel plants use CCS or green hydrogen? From Hugh. At the moment, Hugh, the situation is possibly both. Certainly within the EU, there's a push towards green hydrogen. Elsewhere, particularly in China and some of the other developing countries, there's certainly a push to look at CCUS on steel plants, and indeed there's a push to look at steel plants and other hard to abate systems in OECD countries as well. So I don't think the decision's quite there on that one yet. David Allen has asked me, can Putin win the sanctions war by denying gas to the EU? I think that depends whether I don't think ultimately Putin can win the sanctions war with the number of countries that are stacked up against him, but that's not really the purpose of my presentation. But it certainly looks, as I indicated in one of my slides, having gone from a position where nothing changed, gas was continuing to be supplied, come what may. We're now seeing Russia already starting to apply sanctions on a number of the EU countries, member states, which is going to cause hardship. Which is why there's a lot of consultation going on between Norway, for example, and the EU to get pipeline gas brought into the western side of the EU, possibly via the UK as a bridge, but also looking at introduction of liquid natural gas, which can come from some of the fields that Norway runs. And as I indicated, we may well see liquid natural gas coming from other sources, perhaps in North America. Right. Okay, someone said, Fernando Zancan said, congratulations, Andrew, excellent presentation overview, thank you very much. Chris Every has said, with hydrogen and from lignite plants reaching a point of proven data in Australia, where in Europe do you see the lignite exploitation? I see the lignite exploitation being the eastern countries of the European Union. I don't think we're going to see it we're not going to see it in the EU. I don't think they're going to go for solar powered electrolysis of water. I think and to get so-called green hydrogen, but certainly utilising lignite in the eastern states, I think is a promising opportunity there, which I think they're going to take. And as I said, there's a lot of other countries like Kazakhstan, which is strictly in Asia, which are also starting to look at that. And how is this? And on the same question, how is the CO2 plan to be dealt with? Well, I think that, as I said, that's really going to be certainly the projects I've seen are going forward, looking to introduce CCUS on the plants in due course. They don't at the moment, but in due course, so that you end up with very low carbon hydrogen, but not 100% removal of the carbon dioxide. How does the cost of coal with CCUS compare with wind or solar? How does the cost of coal with CCUS compare with wind or solar? it varies depending on the situation, whether it's onshore wind, offshore wind, how much solar you got, how much backup you require to ensure that the variable renewable energy can be available. As I'm sure you know, Hugh, that variable renewable energy, be it wind or solar, you've got to be looking at some form of dispatchable power to balance the grid when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow. When you've got a very high loading of wind or solar on the grid, that pushes up the total system costs enormously, and doesn't look such an attractive option. We've just released a report on this subject, and I'd refer you to our recent issues of reports. It's one undertaken for us under contract and collaboration with Imperial College, and I think that if you should be able to get hold of that very soon. Tunkum Piateriong has asked, Europe import more hydrogen from United Arab Emirates. Am I correct? That is correct. Yes. That again, there's a lot of different sources out there, and I think people are becoming more imaginative about that. There's certainly a lot of hydrogen that can be available from the European Arab Emirates, and that I think is we're starting to see that, and people are looking beyond their original suppliers because of the problems that are occurring. Below that it says, speaking about security of energy supply, coal could be considered in the energy mix in any case. Oh, sorry, we've had that one already. Yes, I agree with that entirely, provided you've got means to control the carbon emissions in due course. I think, Benedicta, that's brought me to the end of the questions at the moment. Thank you very much for the questions. They're very interesting, and I hope my answers were at least reasonable. But as I said earlier on, if you have additional questions, please, send me an email and I'll do my best to answer them. Back to you, Benedicta.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And all that's left for me to say is the slides from this webinar will be available from our website on the webinar page shortly. And the next webinar from us will be on the 20th of July on treatment of coal fines, and will be presented by Graham Chapman. Thank you all for joining us today, and goodbye.